Good evening. I'm Denise Gilmer-Knudsen. Welcome to A Pledge to Truth and Civility. This is the third segment of a five-part series entitled Informed, Engaged, and Empowered, Ready, Set, Vote. Tonight, we'll be discussing how to spot fake news, the importance of checking facts and sources of information, and strategies for engaging civilly in difficult conversations. This event is hosted by the College of Southern Maryland's Thomas B. Mike Miller Jr. Center for Leadership, Student Life Department, and Equity and Inclusive Diversity Office, and St. Mary's College of Maryland's Center for the Study of Democracy and Student Activities Department. We're living in a time when misinformation and disinformation run rampant. The internet has changed the way we consume information, often pitting traditional journalism against fictional images and stories that are shared and reshared without verifying accuracy. Today, everyone's a reporter, and the news media's role as gatekeeper, upholding journalistic standards, is often hijacked by anything goes. While we know that social media sites are not held to account for accuracy and reliability the same way mainstream media is, it's where most people are now getting their news, and that's scary. The challenge people face trying to determine what is true is daunting, and even the most savvy of us can be manipulated. We're living in a time where media literacy is essential. As media consumers, it's up to us to identify, evaluate, and use information in an ethical way. This evening, we have a panel of scholars and practitioners to help us understand the implications of this issue and give us tips and advice for being engaged citizens in this digital world. But before we begin, a couple of requests. First, please post your thoughts and comments and questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. Second, if you need to use the closed captioning feature, please click the CC on the bottom of your screen now. Finally, we ask everyone to maintain a decorum of respect and model civil behavior as we all learn together. So let's meet our panelists. Michelle Brosco-Christian is a professor of communication at the College of Southern Maryland and has been teaching communication studies nearly 20 years. A former journalist, she holds a master's degree in journalism and strategic public relations from University of Maryland, College Park. Brian O'Sullivan earned his master's in English and comparative literature at Columbia University and his PhD in English at Temple University. He's department chair and associate professor of English at St. Mary's College of Maryland with teaching interest in parody and satire and rhetoric of American campaigns and elections. Cara Fogarty is a former radio reporter and producer for NBC Radio and supervising editor for NPR's website. She's taught media writing at CSM for 17 years. Cara earned her master's in journalism from The Ohio State University and currently heads up the CSM Nonprofit Institute, as well as working freelance. Welcome to you all. So let's start with the big question. How do we know what is true? I mean, let's start with you, Cara. Fake news is not really a new concept, is it? Can you give us some history and context there?
Sure, sure. So the term fake news has been part of the conversation in the United States as far back as the birth of the free press. And in preparing for this, I was doing a little research and I found a wonderful article in Smithsonian Magazine titled "The Age-Old Problem of Fake News." And it noted that President John Adams scribbled a note in a copy of his a work that he had by a French philosopher where the gentleman had predicted that a free press would advance knowledge and create a more informed public. And Adams wrote, quote, "There has been more new error propagated by the press in the last 10 years than in 100 years before 1798. And the article notes that had John Adams written it today and not at the turn of the 19th century, it was just 122 characters. He probably would have tweeted that instead. So the concept of fake news, it actually goes back even earlier. Thomas Hutchison, he was a British loyalist, governor of Massachusetts, 1744 to 58. He said that freedom of the press has been interpreted as the freedom to, quote, print everything that is libelous and scandalous. So fake news as a concept is not new. And I just would like to offer this in context that there are different types of fake news. And just quickly, there's news satire. That's a program like The Daily Show using humor to contextualize and mock real world events. There's news parody like The Onion, which creates made up stories for comedy. Propaganda created by governments to influence public perceptions. That's a form of fake news. Manipulation of real photos or videos to create a false narrative. That's another. Content generated by advertising or public relations teams that are made to appear as though it was generated by a news outlet. That could be in this category. And then finally, there is fabrication. Articles and stories with no factual grounding, but put out there in an attempt to pass as legitimate news items. Example of that was the Pope endorsing Donald Trump when he was running for president. That was a fabricated story. So.
Good, but excellent background. You did that in short order. So you kind of gave a little background there on all the and the different definitions of fake news and different types of fake news. The concept, though, of fake news in modern times has taken on different meanings other than that, that can be kind of problematic because it seems to kind of blur the lines between that and legitimate news. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So fake news, yes, has another use of late, and that is from numerous people who use the phrase to attack legitimate news media. It's used to cast a wide net over very many news stories that are actually full of truth and facts. So this usage, or what we could call the weaponization of fake news, functions as a slur against news outlets that some believe are inherently flawed by, a liberal or a conservative bias. And one thing I would like to note is many people like to criticize, quote, the media. They cast everything into one category as the media. But I just wanted to note for our conversation tonight, there's a huge difference between people spouting their opinions on Fox, CNN, et cetera, and traditional news, the journalism, where reporters are covering events and issues with usually the best of intentions in a search for truth, objectivity, and fairness. So that's very different than the opinionators, as I like to call them, and we really need to differentiate between the two. It's the difference between the editorial page and the news stories in a newspaper. One is opinion, one is journalism. And those two things are not one and the same. The news media perhaps has not done a very good job at sharing what's under the hood, how the news is made, what gets covered and why and how. It's like a big mystery to a lot of us. And while the news media can certainly help explain and educate, it's also on us to learn and understand. And once we understand the motivation and the methods and the passion in the hearts of journalists, they can begin to understand the news media. The news media is not out to get them, is not out to change their mind, and so on. So just in summary, when you criticize the media, who are you really talking about?
That's a good point, a good differentiation to make for sure. Brian, you actually mentioned during one of our earlier conversations about a type of fake news that might be constructive. And you've studied this and you teach a little bit about this in your classes. What role do parody and satire play in our understanding of this issue? And if you could give some examples.
Brian, your mic is not on.
Your
mic is not on, Brian.
Yeah. Brian, you're muted.
Sorry about that. That's that okay. Too often. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
No problem. So yeah, this will take just a little bit of branching off from Cara's really great history of fake news. I want to go back just to 2004 when Comedy Central started labeling Jon Stewart's Daily Show the most trusted name in fake news. And so the term fake news had now been extended from works of actual deception, right? from hoaxes to material that looked like news, but was honestly labeled in some way as made up or at least exaggerated. And even though the slogan was actually obviously an oxymoron, it was also kind of true. Even Fox News, no ideological ally of The Daily Show, right, ran a page on its website about how seriously this funny show was being taken, not only by its audience, but even by real journalists. Stewart himself didn't see his show as fake news. He didn't use the term. He saw it as real satire. Or if he was being humble, he saw it as just jokes about the news. But on the other hand, his head writer, a guy named Ben Carlin, who had previously been editor of The Onion, he embraced the term fake news and saw this kind of satire as an exercise in seeing, quote unquote, seeing hypocrisy. People who know better saying things that they know are wrong. We saw a real kind of constructive, critical thinking mission in this kind of fake news, one that could actually contend with the other kind and be a strategy for civil discourse. Given this function, humorous fake news practiced by Stewart and Carlin, now by people like Trevor Noah, John Oliver, Samantha Bee, often confronts and exposes deceptive fake news, as well as other vices of the news media. Occasionally, these satirists even come up front and make their critique of the media explicit and unironic. For example, when Stewart was a guest a long time ago on Crossfire, some of you remember a CNN debate show, that it was really the epitome of the tendency of some news media to capitalize on controversy and polarization. Stewart came on in this very disconcertingly earnest and shockingly serious way, asked the host, Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala, why they were hurting America. And his appearance on that show is widely seen as leading to the cancellation of it shortly afterwards. So this ability to counter deceptive fake news is one reason why I call humorous, honestly fake news often constructive. Another reason is that satire has made news palatable and accessible to people who otherwise avoid it, whether because they find it hypocritical, as Carlin did, or because they find it boring, right? Studies by the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Center in 2004 and by the Pew Center in 2007 found that viewers of Comedy Central news program, quote unquote news programs, were on average better informed than viewers and readers of some traditional news sources. Obviously, this doesn't mean that those viewers and readers were being informed by The Daily Show, but maybe they were plugging into The Daily Show because they already recognized the hypocrisy it was trying to expose. One way, I guess, to think of this would be just a little bit of sugar to make the medicine go down. But another way is to think that in a postmodern culture that's not particularly reverential or overtly serious, there might be a need for a less reverential and less overtly serious form of news. I just want to mention that a student of mine some years ago, Marianne Wood, wrote her SMP, her senior project at St. Mary's, about the satirical rhetoric of The Daily Show. And it's a great project. And in it, she saw satirists like Stewart as being in the tradition of jesters or fools in Renaissance courts, people who were famously able to speak truth, the kings and emperors, right? Marianne was largely thinking of people like George Bush and the modern and other modern politicians as the emperors to whom the modern satirists would speak this truth. But, ironically, in today's context, it might be that they're speaking truth to the trolls and bots on the internet.
Well, this brings us to the question. So yeah, we do need that satire and that lift, and it's necessary, right? But we also find when we start looking at the type of news that people watch, people tend to seek out news that fits their views instead of trying to consume unbiased sources of information. Michelle, do we really, as people, do we really want the truth, or maybe we're looking for our version of the truth?
I think we want our truth, of course, because we're social animals, we're humans, and we like to think that we're right. We like to feel smart. Nobody wants to feel that they don't have the answer to everything. And so certainly we seek out in groups, we seek out people who feel the same as we do. It's very natural. So if you feel that way, we're all in this boat together. But it's, as I tell my students, you got to check yourself, because this self-validation that we're seeking is preventing us from seeing when stories are not correct. because whatever side of the fence you're on politically, you're going to seek out validation for the beliefs and the theories you already hold. That's, and it makes us feel good, so we're going to keep seeking more of that. We tend to cling to those beliefs. And even when new evidence comes, if it is not coinciding with our current beliefs, we'll push it aside. And then we'll just go out in search of news and articles and beliefs that confirm those existing hypotheses we have. It's just human nature. And so this is a term that's been thrown around a lot since all of these issues have been occurring, and it's called confirmation bias. So most of you have probably heard of that term, and that's just seeking out that info that backs up what you already believe. So you can see then, while we might say, oh, I watch different channels and I look at different news, where the brain is so resistant to that. Psychologically, we want this feeling of sameness and self-validation.
Wow, that's such a great point, and brings us to our next discussion point, which is based on a Pew Research study that was released earlier this year, and that found that Americans, there were deep divides in the news sources that Americans tended to watch, and it was based on partisan politics, and that had to do with their trust and distrust in the media and how much they relied on the media. Cara, back to you. What are some of the effects of this polarization on news consumption? And I think we have a slide to go with this as well.
Yeah, so let me explain this chart first that you're looking at. It is from Ad Fontes Media. And this is an organization that was founded 2 years ago, a woman named Vanessa Otero. She created this chart. And their mission, they say, is to, quote, to make news consumers smarter and news media better. Okay, they rate the news for reliability and bias. They want to help people navigate the news landscape. And just note that ad fontes is Latin for to the source. Okay, and that's what they say it does, that they look at the source. They analyze the content itself to rate it. They appear to be transparent about who they are, what they do, and how they do it. And this is the media bias chart. It gets updated pretty regularly. This is the latest iteration of it as of June of this year. And they describe this as a unique way of laying out the complex media landscape in 2 dimensions. So you have reliability on the vertical axis and bias on the horizontal axis. And it's very interesting to see the different news sources and where they fall on this chart. And it does change over time. They slide a little bit. I mean, there's not a huge shift from one side to the other, but they do shift around a little bit. And so it's interesting. And then, so to the, you might find yourself in one side or the other, or somewhere in the middle there. You can look at that chart and see where you fall yourself. But to the question of polarization, the effects of polarization of news consumption on democracy, it's huge. So political polarization damages institutions in a democracy. It shatters informal but important norms of tolerance and moderation that keep political competition within the bounds of acceptability. When we have skeptical views of institutions and social structures towards distrust and anger and internal fighting, that leads to inaction. That's bad for society. It's bad for democracy. And then polarization, especially with this news, when you're sticking to your own area, it permeates society everywhere. All right. It poisons interactions and relationships between families, friends, coworkers, that sort of thing. So consuming news solely from sources you agree with or like, it puts you in an echo chamber where you're insulated from opposing views. It becomes, my way or the highway, so to speak. And when you have ideologically rigid mentalities, it just lowers the chances of compromise and working together and frankly, just getting along.
Well said. So now that we've kind of defined the concept of fake news or misinformation, disinformation, kind of differentiated that, let's move on to the second part, which is what can we do about it? So I thought it would be fun to give our audience a little quiz to see how well we can spot fake news. So let's try some. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull up each slide, and you'll have 20 seconds to look at the post or the page. So some of these are going to be a post, a single item, and others are going to be items that are taken from a page. And your job is going to be to vote whether you think that each of those slides are real or fake. So you're only going to have two choices. And real quick, when we show each one, you may need to slide the graphic to the right or left, because there's one thing that lets you vote, and then there's one thing that is the actual graphic that you're going to look at. So if you take your cursor across the top, you can slide one way or the other if one is interrupting the other. So let's start with the first slide, and we'll start the clock and have 20 seconds, and you can vote. Is this real or is this fake? Oopsie daisy. Let's see. So we went back. Yeah, this is the one we're going to start with. So disregard. We'll move to that next one in a second. So this is the Trump Marine one. We're going to start with that. Is this real or is this fake? So you can vote now. So once our numbers are in, we can, oh, okay, let's see. So 10% of our audience thought that the post was real. 90% thought it was fake. So the 90% were correct. Yay. That was pretty good. So no, President Trump did not have an oxygen tank and tubing concealed under his jacket as he boarded Marine One to be taken to Walter Reed. Yes, he did receive oxygen at the White House before leaving for Walter Reed. So you can see how some of these concepts get kind of twisted and brought together. And then, you know, we have a picture that is putting something out there, but that one was fake news. So good. Let's go to the next slide. So is this real or fake news? And whenever we get our respondents back in, we'll see what the numbers were. Okay, this one was a little tougher. So there's a little more of an even split. 58% think this is real, 42% fake. So this is real. This is a real person. Some of the things to look for are those personal identifying information. Notice that he talks about his community. So he's actually connecting to something around him. He also includes information about his life. Sometimes if it's a bot or a troll, you won't find that personal information on there. So that was a hint that, you know, some folks got. So good job on that one too. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And we're going to vote. Is this fake news or is this real? You lost a little bit of the picture there in the way the screen is framing it. So you can't see the bottom part. It would make it a little, you'd be able to see a little better, but. And what are the results on that one? Okay, so a little bit more of a 75% think it's fake and 25% real. That one is a little bit tougher. This is actually fake news. The video in the tweet, it's a clip or a picture from a video, does not show bikers praying in support of Trump. It is an August 29 video of a protest against violent crimes targeting farmers in South Africa. So this picture came from Pretoria, South Africa. So if you said fake, you're correct. All right, we got 2 more to go. Let's the next one. Real or fake? Cast your vote. All right, what are our results? Oh, 75-25 again. 75% think it's fake, 25 real. Y'all are doing pretty good. So it is, this is a Russian troll site. And some of the things to look for in identifying potential trolls are hoax events, which you did see that one event there that I had not heard of on mainstream media. Profiles of attractive women, usually younger attractive women, things that are make you think of a scary world, you know, everything's bad out there and things are going to come and hurt you. Also, there was some incorrect grammar. I'm not sure if you picked up on that or not. So those are a couple things there to look at. All right, last one. Is this real or fake? All right, what are our results? Oh, split, 50-50 split. Wow. So that one was a little hard, I admit. And I think there are a couple reasons why, but that's a real page. That's a person's page. He's real. He works in the health nutrition field, and he's the owner of a website called Natural News. So a couple of things on there made me question too, because it said there were areas where content not available. That was a red flag. I thought maybe not. But, and then there was something about eating wheatgrass would make your hair not turn gray. And I thought, that sounds a little bit wonky. So, but it's true. He does link off to a little bit, some other sites that may not be quite legit, but his page is legit. He's legit. He's not a bot. So good job. You guys did really great on that. God, so Cara, to bring it back to you, what are some warning signs we look for? We found a few here, but what are, if you're looking at news, is this news or is this coming from somewhere else? How do we identify misinformation and disinformation? What should we look for?
Let me unmute there. Well, it's interesting. The World Health Organization declared earlier this year that we had an infodemic, which is, quote, an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not. And that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And no one's saying that we need to seek out things we agree with. We're saying we need to seek out information that we want, and to discover that it's truth and verifiable, as opposed to opinion and that sort of thing. So there's numerous tools available to check and verify, but at the end of the day, it's on us to be informed, to be responsible, to do our homework. So one thing you can do is check the source and check the source's sources. So if something comes to you, a news story, whether it's through email or on social or wherever, you see something, whether it's from a family member, a friend, a celebrity, a public official, take the time to examine it before you accept it as fact and pass it along, okay? Check it against trusted authorities. Look and see what other news outlets are reporting on the same topic. Is it similar or wildly different? If it's wildly different, that's something you might want to take note. Ask yourself if someone is the source of the information or the person sharing it with you, are they trying to exploit your fear? Is their intention to help? Do they have other motivations? And perhaps really important, check your own bias. Our brains repeat patterns in order to make decisions quickly, and our brains will selectively seek out information that confirms what we already believe. Michelle, spoke about that. And, those mental shortcuts don't always lead to accurate conclusions.
Good advice. So on the flip side, so that was how, what are signs it might not be right? Well, what can we use on the other side to make sure that what we're getting is verifiable? What are some tips for locating solid news sources?
Okay, so one thing you can do is really, at the end of the day, consume news from a variety of sources, including sources you think you don't agree with. If you like the reporting on the New York Times and NPR, you need to watch Fox News. And again, I'm talking about the news. I'm not talking about the people spouting their opinions. I'm not talking about all the talking heads. I'm talking about the actual reported pieces, by journalists. The people who are spouting their opinions, that's not journalism, okay? I asked my husband this question last night. He's a producer for NPR. He produces newscasts every night from our living room. So I have a newsroom in my house. He said, not only should you get your news from a variety of sources, you should spend half your news consumption time with sources you do not agree with. You need to be an informed consumer of news. Do not just accept what is put in front of you. Know what you're consuming, read the about pages, discover who's behind the name, learn about the source. Who are the people involved? Research who they are. There are names of news organizations out there that resemble traditional news organizations, but they're not the real thing. I've seen where people will share what they thought was a news story only to discover it was a parody. And all you had to do was read the about page on the source's website where it stated something along the lines of, this is a parody website. I mean, the information was right there. I guess, there's a lot of tools to check things. PolitiFact is one of my favorites. It's by the Poynter Institute. But I guess at the end of the day, really, the famous quote from Ronald Reagan, even though he was referencing the Soviet Union, it applies to so many things in life, and that is trust but verify.
Good point. Wow. Well, this brings us to the third part of our program, and it links us back with the idea of inaccurate and biased news, because basically what we're watching and what we're reading, especially if it's inaccurate, it's so divisive. And it's no surprise that if, as your graphic showed earlier, if part of us are watching only one thing and part of us are watching only another thing, and we're only hearing what we believe, that we get these silo mentalities, and that's not good for anybody. It also impacts civility. Michelle, how can we have meaningful conversations with people who may think differently than we do?
Well, it's really hard. You know, a number of us up here, three of us on a panel, teach communication. And one of the biggest things that we struggle with is getting our students to be able to see things from other viewpoints. And that's critical thinking. And going against this, this desire to just keep getting confirmation or confirmation bias to make us feel comfortable and that we're right. It's such a hard thing. You have to fight against it every single day. I mean, I tell students, check yourself every day because, I don't myself above this. I throw myself right in there. I have to check myself every day because as a former journalist and being trained at a university that had high ethical standards, I was taught to keep my opinion to myself. So someone in the chat had said, journalists should be unbiased. Yes, they should. And if they're properly trained, they will be the highest level they can. But we are humans and we have feelings. And so we have to check ourselves all the time. And so I know Denise and Cara and I have all been trained journalists. We have bachelor's degrees in this, and we've been in the field. And so we hold ourselves to a high standard. If you have not been trained in that field, you probably don't even understand what these ethical things mean. So it's just very critical, and we have to learn to listen to others. It's one of the hardest things to do, hearing something you don't want to hear. But I think the tone of voice that someone takes and the authenticity, do they really care? Are they actively listening and want to hear your perspective? I have a hard time listening when someone's yelling in my face. But if they take a calmer tone, sure, I'll listen, even if you're opposing the opposite side of me. So to me, that's a real kind of key.
Good advice. Brian, you mentioned that sometimes incivility is really related to a problematic idea about what it means to argue. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, thank you. This is taking me back for a second to parody, just for a second, because it makes me think of a Monty Python sketch called The Argument Clinic that I watched long ago, that Sybil Anderson introduced me to long ago, where a guy walks into an office to pay for an argument. Strange thing to do. But that's the premise of the sketch. By the way, it's a really funny sketch. Look it up if you don't know it, The Argument Clinic. But he walks into the clinic to pay for an argument. And it's not only funny, but a little deep, right? This guy thinks he's going to get a rational argument designed to get some shared understanding of what's true. And what he gets instead is someone who just contradicts every single thing he says, even whether or not he is paid or whether or not they're having an argument at all. I guess, the good thing is that today you don't have to pay for that kind of argument. You can get it for free on Facebook or Twitter if you haven't already muted the people that you disagree with. The sociolinguist Deborah Tannen, writing in 1998, calls this tendency towards contradiction the argument culture, right? And the argument culture, she said, I'm going to quote from her, urges us to believe that the best way to discuss an idea is to set up a debate. We've recently seen on TV that that's not always true. The best way to cover news is to find spokespeople who express the most extreme polarized views and present them as both sides. It's exactly that kind of thinking that was featured on that Crossfire show I mentioned that Jon Stewart mocked and got canceled. It's a kind of argument, so-called argument, that often seems to make for good TV, good ratings, good ad revenue, but not good public conversations. It's not backed with evidence. It's not empathetic in the least, right? So real argument requires trying to empathize with the other person, as Michelle said, try to solve problems with them, and above all, not just trying to defeat them.
Yeah. That's a really good point. It may not bring in advertising dollars, but it might help it with your interpersonal relationships. So that's pretty important, right? Oh, so we're gonna hop over. I had a couple of other questions left, and if we have time, we'll come back to them. But I wanted to go to our audience questions and see if we have any audience members that would like to pose a question or a comment to any of our panelists tonight. And we have chat moderators who will be reading those and presenting those to our panelists.
All right, so we have a statement here from Mary Sue. It should not be that the general public has to seek news we agree with or disagree with. News should be unbiased and without opinion.
Exactly. That's what we've been saying. News should be unbiased and without opinion, and that we tend to stick to things that the confirmation bias that confirm what we already think things we already like. But that's exactly what we've been saying, is that news should be unbiased and with fact and without opinion. And that's why I was trying to distinguish early on the difference between, the talking heads and all the opinion people screaming and yelling versus the actual journalism. I cannot, with a few exceptions of plagiarism issues, I cannot tell you that any real journalist sets out with an agenda. As Michelle was talking about with the being trained in this, they typically set out with to seek objectivity, which is hard, to seek out the truth and to seek out, the facts. So I'm not saying that you need to seek out the opinion. I'm saying you need to seek out other things that are not like what you like.
Right. I wanted to just jump in and add as well that when we're trained as journalists, I took it so seriously. Many of my friends probably didn't know what my political beliefs were. Because when I was reporting on political things, I would not hang out with people that I covered. I had such a high ethical standard. I didn't want there to be any whiff of impropriety. And I would say that, I was just a local community reporter. So I'm assuming that the people that are high level, they have great stakes. If they get facts wrong, they will be fired. And so you have to look for the news outlets that have people that were trained like we were, have ethical standards, and are not spouting off opinion. They are saying, this is what I saw, this is what the person said. And yes, bias can come into it because we're human beings. And just by leaving certain things out and putting certain things in, yes, there can be a spin, but good reporters check themselves for that every day, every minute.
Okay, we have a question from Eileen. Real people don't necessarily post real news. Fake news can be perpetuated and written by people you know. Is this to distinguish bots or fake news? These aren't the same thing.
I'll speak to that for a moment. And I think the example that we used is what she's referring to. Yep. And she's absolutely right. The examples that we use, some of them were actual pages. The other ones were, is this a bot or is this a real person? So I probably should have differentiated there a little bit, but absolutely. I think real people can post things that are untrue, and bots could post things that are true, right? So it's definitely, I think that's a good point to make.
By the way, I think that last example, the nature guy, was a good example of this, right? Because I think that while he was a real person, he was putting some sketchy information out, and he was doing it largely, I think, for a profit, if I remember right? He was selling products by putting out some false information. So yeah, it's a good example of exactly what they're talking about.
We have a question from Mark. If we know a person is real and not a bot, how do you know they are not sharing fake news?
You don't. You don't. This can be something on social, it can be in an email, it can be a friend, it can be a family member. This is part of the infodemic, the problem that there's so much out there and so much swirling around, you don't really know. And so you really need to trust but verify. That's something, the person is real and they're sharing a story with you. Take that story and do some research. See what other news organizations are reporting on that same topic. If it's wildly different, there's a clue that maybe something isn't right.
Okay, we have a question from Anna. You said earlier that people always want to hear validation of their political views. I'm sure there are exceptions to this. Do you think that everyone seeks validation politically? Is there an example that sticks out to you of someone who didn't seek political validation and made a positive difference?
I think we are the exceptions. It just applies to everybody else, but we are pure of heart and motive and always look. No, just kidding. But I do think everyone probably feels that way, right? I think every individual probably feels like they're the exception to confirmation bias and that they're honestly motivated to challenge all of their preconceptions. And I do agree with you. I think that it's a tendency. It's not a universal rule that most of us at some time are probably a little bit more open than at other times to challenging our preconceptions.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I'm racking my brain trying to think of someone who everybody would know that does this. But I think that the people that have been successful in politics, uniquely successful, are the ones who do that. And I'm sure there's lots of politicians out there who reach across the aisle, maybe not so much today, but in the past, who have made things work because they did that.
And the only thing I would add is, I don't think we said that people always want to hear validation. It happens subconsciously too. You don't even realize, we don't realize that we do that. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I have a statement from Naomi. I think it is very important to listen to both sides of the story and to do research on the subject.
Yay. Agree, 100%.
I have a statement from Joan. This is not a question, but I know for a fact Instagram and Twitter are cracking down on fake news and fact check people.
They are, and Facebook is too. They're taking different efforts and trying to label things. If you go on Twitter or even on Facebook, sometimes a little thing will pop up and say, this is a check mark or whatever the mark is, because we think that it has, some issues with it. And same with Twitter. I don't know about Instagram too much, but.
Okay, I have a question from Angela. Can one of you speak to how advertising dollars and corporate ownership of news outlets can often and sometimes dictate news content?
There's supposed to be an invisible wall between the advertising side and the news side, but that's not usually how it works. But I'll let the other journalists speak.
I think what sometimes happens is it's a subconscious thing that you hesitate to cover something extensively because you happen to know they're a big advertiser, and that's bad. And so you have to bring those thoughts from the subconscious and bring them to the conscious and ignore them. A really good news organization will allow its journalists to cover the stories about their advertising dollar sources. Absolutely. There is supposed to be that firewall between the two, but, one side definitely doesn't dictate in a traditional news organization, but sometimes people will shy away from something. I do remember, plane crashes, and we would have the airline as an advertiser in that newscast, and it wasn't our problem to worry about the advertiser in the newscast. It was up to the advertising side to say, oh my, we have a plane crash, we better pull that ad. It wasn't our concern. We didn't have to worry about it.
There's a question from Ruth. The ad chart showed that most news media outlets are questionable. Where do we go for reliable news? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, that depends on what the term questionable is. Kind of like what does is mean. But if you go look at that chart and go towards the middle, so it said that if you have enough people on the right and people on the right and people on the left complaining about your news stories, then you're doing something right. I used to edit the ombudsman column at National Public Radio, and at the time it was the Palestinians and Israelis. It was always in the news, and it was always, they were getting emails every day from people all over the issue. And the ombudsman would say, our coverage must be good. We must be doing something right if everybody's got a complaint. So if you're not making one side happy or the other side, then you're doing something down the middle. So my recommendation for Ruth would be to look at the middle of that chart and, check out some of the news organizations that showed up in the middle, and check them out and see what you like. You may hear, oh, that news organization is left, and oh, that news organization is right. Decide for yourself.
That's why that chart is so wonderful, because you can just get an idea there of who's clustered in the center there. And we all have different kind of preferences, how the news style delivery. I'm a very kind of factual person. I don't want all kinds of bells and whistles. That turns me off. So I like a very simple, I like it clearly explained. And so you can find those different things. Some of that becomes a, preference. But yes, definitely in that center of that chart, those people should be well-trained journalists, and they are checking their bias, hopefully, minute to minute.
And the one other thing I would add is the variety of types of news. If you get all your news just from television, that's not good, because you're only getting the news that has video to accompany it. You want to get news from television, from radio, or such as it is anymore, podcasts, from newspapers, and you can find all that online. You can find all that on social media. I asked my students, where do you get your news from? They're like, Twitter. I said, no, Twitter is a platform. It's not a news source. You need to know where your news is coming from, and you can find it all in all these different platforms. But mix it up. Read a newspaper, read an article, read news magazines like The Atlantic or something, and balance that with a little bit something that leans a little conservative. Get some news from television, get some news from a variety of things. Do not, whatever you do, just rely on television for news, because it's a very skewed view of the world.
I really like your point about getting a balanced diet, not only of kinds of news, but of those ideological orientations, because I guess I would suggest not only going to the center, and I think you said it yourself, balance out what you look at on the left with something from the right, because all those perspectives, I mean, we can call them biases, but they're also valid perspectives, right? And to have more than one perspective to look at the world, good thing.
Absolutely.
So we have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to give our panelists 1 minute each for closing remarks. Give us your final thoughts tonight, Cara.
Well, I think I just did. I think that's the thing I would like to leave it with. Get, not only a variety of sources of news, but a variety of platforms you're receiving it on, because, you have a news event, and TV, radio, and newspapers and websites and everything, they're all going to cover it differently because of their platform. So, a newspaper reporter, the New York Times or some other newspaper in America, is going to give you a very long story, right, with lots of information, lots of detail. A network newscast, their pieces are 2 minutes if we're lucky. Okay, so you can't fit a lot of information in there. So get your news not only from a variety of sources and check them, and find things that you feel are credible and newsworthy, and a variety of platforms too.
And you should know, because you teach writing across various media, so you're a good person to talk about that.
We write for everything.
Michelle, last thoughts.
Okay, I'm going to keep it real simple, like a journalist, a true journalist. Pause, think, maybe respond. And every minute, check yourself, check your implicit bias, because it's there, even for us.
Wow, good advice. Brian, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I guess I'll say I think we focused rightly on what we should think of as consumers of the news. But as someone mentioned before, we're all reporters now, we're all producers of the news as well. So I think you should take the same critical thinking we've been talking about and apply it to every social media post. Actually, I think we should take the same critical thinking skills we've talked about and apply them to every social media post that we do, apply them to everything we repost, right? Think about what not only the facts behind what we're posting up or what the possible effects of it might be on the people who read it. And we'll try to make a more constructive rhetoric, a more constructive public language that way.
Good advice. Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. We'll be hosting one more public event in this series on October 22nd, 2 weeks from tonight at same time at 7 p.m. This one is Liberty and Justice for All, the History of Voting Rights in America, with CSM Professor of History, Dr. Christine Arnold-Laurie, and St. Mary's College Professor of Political Science, Dr. Susan Grogan. So that promises to be a really interesting and timely discussion. Advanced registration is required, and you can visit the Miller Center for Leadership on the College of Southern Maryland website for details on how to join in. Thank you to our audience for tuning in tonight. It's been so much fun. We've enjoyed it, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Take care. Good night.